Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Jason Buffington, here for another Industry Insights this week. So you might notice that I'm not going to be with Dave Russell this week. Instead, I am super excited. One of my dearest friends and most esteemed colleagues in the data protection industry, Jeff Reichard, is joining us today. Jeff, you and I have been we've worn the same shirts in a couple different industries, but your focus has almost always been drawn into public service, public sector, and then all of the regulatory hoopla that comes along with that. So thank you so much for joining us this week.
Yeah, delighted to be here. I'm excited to talk about the research we'll go over today.
So before we get into the research, I should make a plug that because Jeff does a lot with public sector, he is based in the Northeast. Meanwhile, I hail from the great state of Texas, along with our social media queen. Production actually runs out of Georgia with our producer extraordinaire. But tell us where you're from. Along the way, we'd like to find that out. So let's light the map up in green, hopefully, along the way. So pile on for that, and we'll revisit that in just a few minutes. Thinking about the map, though, when we talk about the breadth of where all of us are from and where we're going to be tuning in from today, let's use that as the gamut for the breadth of where platforms live in a modern public sector organization. Now, as a friendly reminder, this actually is another episode that's built on data gleaned from the Data Protection Trends Report for 2023. This is the largest report of its kind, 4,200 responses around the world, 28 countries, organizations of all sizes. One of the key design elements this year, and the reason it keeps getting bigger, is so that we can add different segments, and in this case, different verticals, to really understand how one industry might vary from another. And so Jeff has actually done the hard work of gleaning out the public sector data so we can look at how does public sector look different than private sector when it comes to macro data protection trends. Jeff, can we take a look at, you've got the lens that we've always looked at for hybrid infrastructure and the momentum shift, and then compare that with what we're seeing on the public sector side?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the great things, as Jason just mentioned, about the size of our data protection trend survey is that it gives us statistically relevant, meaningful slices that we can use to look at all kinds of industries. In public sector, just under 10% of our respondents this year worked either in federal or national level government in their country or in state or local government. Now, if you've tuned in with Jason and Dave before, you've probably seen a variant of this. Basically, every year that we run the survey, we ask folks where their infrastructure is now, and if they look in the crystal ball, where they see it going. And Jason, I think for the last couple of years, from the general pool of respondents, what we've seen, as we have in this slide, is that roughly a quarter of the workloads are still on physical servers in the data center, roughly a quarter are in VMs, and half of what organizations are running now is running up in the cloud. That's correct, right?
Yeah, so we saw that first shift. You can see the hockey stick on that left-hand side. 2020, that first data was pre-COVID, and then everything after that is post-COVID. And so you see that material shift that happened when work from home and you couldn't get in the data center if you wanted to, right? So there was a material shift to cloud there, and then from there we see pretty much a normalization that's been relatively flat, plus or minus 2 points along the way. So you've been tracking public sector anecdotally. This year we get to put some data in it. Jeff, what did you find?
We do. So sometimes you talk with folks, even in public sector organizations, and there's this perception that perhaps state and local government are behind in moving to the cloud, or that federal, for security or whatever reasons, maybe heterogeneous environments, are behind in moving to the cloud. The data does not reinforce that. In fact, what we find when we look at the data is that public sector organizations, and again, we're lumping together for this particular statistic, both federal and state and local in one large umbrella. But what we find is that they have perhaps a few more physical servers on-prem and perhaps very slightly less virtualized servers, although definitely within the range of error for the survey.
Sure.
And that they're almost identical in terms of cloud adoption, which means basically that this same hockey stick, this large migration that you mentioned, maybe driven in part by COVID, driven by modernization efforts, that we've seen globally across all sectors and all sizes of organizations has definitely been mirrored in what our public sector organizations we survey have done. They are just as hybrid, just as distributed as any other kind of organization on earth at this point.
Okay, so good news and bad news that I think I just heard. Good news is that as we look at what is prescriptive moving forward, it probably resembles rest of the world because they're in the same kind of gamut and landscape. The bad news is I can tell you from the last several weeks that we've been covering this data, this particular distribution actually creates a lot of challenges for organizations because there's no longer a single hero scenario that data protection has to solve for. And as organizations have in many cases modernized production faster than protection, we find that all of those folks on that right-hand side are in many cases underprotected or maybe undersatisfied. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's absolutely the case. And anyone that has tuned in before to listen to you and Dave talk about the reality gap, and for those of you who maybe haven't seen this before, what we ask every year is there a gap in how quickly you can recover versus how quickly the mission or the business needs you to recover? That's the top bar here. And you'll notice in the general population, 82% of organizations surveyed either agree or strongly agree we couldn't get back up and running as quickly as we need to. When we ask a slightly nuanced, different version of that question, which is, what about data loss? Are you protecting your data as often as you need to? That is, to avoid data loss. You see 79%, so statistically almost a dead heat, with the first question, are unhappy with that. And Jason, this has unfortunately been fairly consistent for a while in the data, hasn't it?
It has. Typically in most cases, we're seeing roughly around 4 out of 5 organizations on that availability gap. They have a higher expectation. I think in large part, we see that because if there's one thing the last couple of years have taught us, it's how dependent on IT services that we are. The latter question, protection gap sounds like a really glossy marketing term. For the IT professionals that are listening to this today, protection gap really is when you ask the business, how much data could you lose? And it's, 2-3 hours, best case. And then you say, we back up every other night, right? You too have a protection gap. How are we doing in public sector, my friend?
All right. So if we compare public sector for this and we look at the top, that is the recovery gap, how quickly we could get back up and running. You notice that state and local government, which is the column on the left, is identical to the larger population. That is actually doing a little bit better, which is nice to see. Only 76%, not 82%. That trend continues when we ask about the data loss gap, the protection gap. If you look, the general population is 79%. That is 35 plus 44. Yes, I either agree or strongly agree that we'd lose more data than we wanted to. State and local, pretty much a dead heat for that at 77. But again, Fed is doing a little bit better. This is encouraging news. We're gonna have kind of a mix of good news and bad news about public sector data protection as we go through the talk and sort of where the drivers for public sector look the same and then look different. But this piece of news, at least for Fed, is slightly better. For state and local government, it's roughly a dead heat. They look about like the rest of the population. And one thing we've seen, Jason, and you just alluded to it, as we move platforms to new organizations, to new environments that are providing citizen services, that are taking care of constituents, that are running the mission, the expectations of our communities that are relying on those services go up. And so even though they're getting information faster, they become accustomed to getting information faster to an instant response. And when they don't get information that quickly, it's a real drag. It's unfortunate. I know when I take my walk every morning, I live in a city, and we have a little app that everyone in the city can use. If you see that someone has dumped something out, if you see that there's roadkill, if you see any issue, any civic issue, you can just take a picture of it, type it in, and it's there. And I'll tell you personally, I get kind of aggravated when I try to use that and it's down because I want to make my voice heard right away. And I think that's why we see this gap persisting even as SLAs for responses to citizens get better.
Make my voice heard right away. I mean, what a single great banner cry for what the power of democracy ought to look like. And I know this, we're talking about public sector today, but I was on a healthcare symposium a couple weeks ago. And one of the things we talk about is often we get kind of a sterile view of when we talk about IT and data protection trends because we think about zeros and ones and bytes and dollars and those kind of things. And on the healthcare symposium, we talked about, you can't get data to a surgeon when they're actually in a process. You can't find trends for what the next drug is going to, data matters, right?
Hmm.
I love the examples that you gave as far as the service to the citizenry. You and I both have many friends who have served in militaries over the years, and when you talk about the mission has to go on, that is certainly a key part. My son is a police officer, right? So there is
Yep.
data that he needs on the side of the road in real time, and there is no tolerance for lack of availability of data along that way. So I love the fact that we're seeing that same trend. I actually really like the fact that maybe government's doing a little bit better. Either that, or maybe their expectations are a little lower. We could argue about that on a different day. But I do think that because they're seeing the same challenges, maybe they're seeing the same kinds of drivers. Before we go there, though, let's find out what all countries are represented, because certainly this governmental public sector data, this is not U.S. centric. This is all federal agencies, all local, state, province, region, whatever you want to call it. Let's find out where folks are. So if we look on the United States first, let's take a look. It looks like Pennsylvania is in the house here. We got North Carolina. Couple folks in California that we saw chimed in separately for that. Costa Rica, been a while since we've seen them. Very nice. Let's see if we head back over to Europe. Always nice to see my friends in Germany coming on board. Very nice. Center of the peninsula there. Let's go down a little bit. I think that's Nigeria in the house. I don't get down there as often as I want, but and India and Bangladesh in that upper right-hand corner. Thank y'all for tuning in as well. And let's see. Oh, we actually even have a question before we kind of pile back in. So there's a question on does Veeam do AIX backup? And Jeff, I think the answer is yes on that. It's as part of both either physical AIX or if you ran AIX in a VM, we would protect it as a whole instance as well as from the other side. So yeah.
Yep. We absolutely do AIX backup.
And Jeff, as we transition to the next slide, you should take a look at the other comments that we got around viruses, because so David asked a question earlier on a breach. Why can't a huge worldwide company fix this? I'd love for you to chime in on this, because frankly, we're gonna this chart cues us up really well. So let me walk you through the chart, at Jeff, as you familiarize with the question, and maybe you can integrate it into your answer. So
Absolutely.
one of the questions that we've asked for the last several years in the DPR research has been what causes, plural, of outages have you had? And those are the green lines on the right. And in 2022, a cyber event was actually the most common cause of outage in the green lines. Also, each year we asked what was the cause of the single most impactful outage that you had. And unfortunately, for 3 report years in a row, 3 different sets of blind, unbiased respondents, a cyber event was the cause of the most impactful outage that we've had year over year. Jeff, can you address David's question, and then let's see from there, how is public sector doing compared to private in the war against cyber?
Absolutely. The answer to your question, David, is that even though multi-billion-dollar corporations are working on this from a number of angles, from the data protection angle, from the network security angle, from the security incident and event management angle, et cetera, it's an arms race. And unfortunately, our adversaries are also extremely well organized and well funded. And because this criminal business enterprise has been so profitable, and because it has also served the interests of some adversarial nation states like North Korea, which derives a lot of hard currency from this kind of activity, it's not going away as quickly as we would like. Now, there is good news. Mandiant's latest M23 State of Ransomware report, which actually came out last month, well, I'll just talk about a little bit different research for a second, notes that dwell times are going down. That is, the length of time the adversaries on your network is going down. And part of the reason for that is that we're getting better at spotting the bad guys after they've only been on the network for a little while. That's slightly mirrored by some of the data that we got for public sector. What's interesting for public sector for this particular question this year is that last year, public sector, both state and local and federal, cyber incidents were both the most common and the most impactful cause of outages. This year, they took second place. They only took second place by a little, but they did take second place behind infrastructure and networking outages as the most common cause of outages. Of course, just because we tend to focus a lot on cyber these days doesn't mean that we can ignore all the other things that can happen that are bad to your network. And obviously, every year we ask in this top 10, what about other kinds of things like accidental deletion of data? And you'll notice that shows up in the top 5 for both state and local and for Fed. We ask about the regular kind of outages that we've all been laboring with ever since there were computers for us to rely on that would go out. And then, of course, there are other things that can go wrong too, both operating system and administrator error. I will point out on the cyber front, one of the things that all data protection companies, and certainly Veeam, are making a big effort to do now is make sure that when you have backups of your data, they are secure. They are very, very difficult, either accidentally through a misconfiguration or intentionally, if we have a bad actor, an adversary on the network, for those to be eliminated. And since 5 out of 10 of the top 10 causes of outages here are things that human beings do, it's pretty clear that we've still got to keep focused on that, because bad things that people do either accidentally or on purpose are still bringing our systems down.
Really, really well said. I'm also going to put a plug in for in just over 3 weeks. We are going to be releasing, as part of Veeam in May, we'll be releasing the second annual ransomware trends report, and so that has more insights from this year. We asked an independent research firm to go and find 1,200, up from 1,000, 1,200 organizations, all of whom suffered at least one cyber event successfully in 2022, trying to capture some of those lessons learned. And David, I think, if I had to bring it down to one nut reason, the reason that we're still having the many problems is because cyber is good business. I think, Jeff, is what you were saying is that people are paying the ransom, right? And as long as people keep paying, in many cases because they don't think they have the ability to recover otherwise, as long as they keep paying, the criminals will keep innovating and evolving at a faster rate. So, which is kind of where we're scary. David also brings up the idea that backups were corrupted also. Yes, so when you look at the ransomware report, and I'm not allowed to leak the data early, but what you'll find is it is absolutely standard operating procedure in exactly 100% of cases, vast majority, that the first thing the bad actor often goes after is the backups, because the bad actor basically is selling you the potential to survive this attack. Like if you had been thrown overboard on a boat, they want to sell you a life preserver. And the only reason you wouldn't buy that life preserver is because you have some other means of flotation nearby. And so the idea is that bad actor is going to get rid of that other means of flotation, so you have no other choice than to buy their life preserver. And so that is absolutely standard operating procedure. Yeah, please keep the comments and the questions coming along the way. So, but while we do that, though, Jeff, I do want to respect the data that you prepared for us. So we've talked about cyber as the major cause of outage. So now we're seeing that pain point that aligns with the protection gap and reality gap conversation that you shared with us earlier. I can also tell you, I don't think we have a slide for it this time. In the DPR research, we show that only 15% of organizations said they did not suffer at least one attack last year, which I think also comes back to what David was sharing in the chats from earlier, right? So 85%, and many of them actually suffered more than one attack. And I would argue that's not only because of the aggressiveness of the bad actors, but because the organizations may be slow to identify how do they initially get in. How do they solve that so it doesn't have a repeat offender? I mean, there's a lot of things that come into that. Part of that also is, how do I improve my backup posture so that I can recover instead of paying? Jeff, we talk about what does modern data protection look like. Your data kind of bears that out, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Now, it's not going to be a surprise if any of you have listened to Jason and Dave talk about this before, that cyber capabilities are at the top of what the general audience, the global audience of 4,200 respondents to this year's survey were looking for. You'll notice number one ask is to integrate data protection with a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy. Number two, very, very closely allied to that, is to integrate with my automated systems management. And if you think about how automated and how service-oriented modern security systems are, these two really go together quite a bit, right?
Yep.
So this is what people are looking for in a backup solution. With respect to cyber attacks, it's worth mentioning, to Jason's point from a second ago, that public sector look no different in terms of the frequency than other organizations do. State and local and federal government got hit an average of twice last year, just like banks, just like manufacturing concerns, pharmaceutical companies, and all other kinds of organizations. That was basically the global average in our survey. Some unfortunates got hit a lot more, some got hit less, but if you average it out, this is definitely still something that our public sector organizations listening today are going to have to be taking on. Now, if we look at how public sector differs from the global sample specifically, in other words, what are you looking for in your solution? It's not a surprise, right? Based on what we just heard, it's exactly the same as the larger audience pool, right? We want backup and cyber integration. And number two, and number three for Fed, also very closely aligned. We need it to be API driven. We need it to be automatable. The rest of the answers trickle down through the regular items that we're looking at here. But what's interesting is that the next four that I've actually highlighted here, which fills out the top five for Fed and gets us down to number three for state and local, the next four boxes that we fill in are all related to getting data into the cloud, getting data out of the cloud, and moving data between clouds. So this is clearly a pain point for public sector organizations. And there have been some organizations in the news in the last couple of years that have stumbled when they were trying to do this and have made headlines in ways that they didn't like.
So, and again, this brings us all the way back to that first point, right? So, in many cases, public sector organizations, the infrastructure layout looks very, very similar to that hybrid trend line that we've seen in the past. And just like everybody else, they couldn't get in the data center back in 2020. Just like everybody else, they have large establishments of physical and virtual and cloud. And so it makes sense that, the cloud means different things to different people, that their initiatives would pair up to that. That's really, really interesting and maybe in some ways affirming from that perspective as well. But you said that state and local have a few variances as far as where some of their top priorities go. Talk about those.
Well, what's interesting, if you look at this list, and obviously Veeam is a mature data protection company, so we're really tuned into all the different ways that you can use backup data, all the functions that it can provide. You'll notice that even though we give people 10 different choices here that are not just cloud, that have to do with other things, standardizing secondary data use cases, alternate use cases, DR as a service, things like that, most of them really are around security, automation, and cloud. It is nice to see when we hear from state and local government that they're looking at DR as a service. I take that to mean that a lot of organizations that maybe had not been aware of the challenges that they were going to face doing this realized that they would benefit from working with a service provider. And we have 10,000 active service providers that we work with at Veeam that do DR as a service, many for state and local governments. And the backup data for alternate use cases also, in many ways, plays directly into the cybersecurity conversation. Jason, I don't know about you, but when I talk with customers who have survived a ransomware event, digital forensics, often driven from looking back through their backup data to see when they first saw indicators of compromise, when the bad guy first got on the network, is a use case that comes up all the time. And backups are great for that.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of the forensics side of these things. Also, I got to say, going back to what we talked about earlier on the importance of delivering the mission and service, I really like the idea that state and local is prioritizing disaster recovery as a service. What we often see, at least from in the private sector side, is that while enterprises often have not only the impetus, they also have the expertise for doing disaster recovery architecture, they also typically have more budget, proportionally speaking, along those lines. Now, I'm a huge, unapologetic fan of disaster recovery as a service because not everybody has multiple data centers. Service gives you that. Not everybody has expertise. Service gives you that. So I love the idea that state and local who don't have the expertise, who probably may not have multiple data centers in all cases, are using DRaaS. But let's talk about the budget implications for this, because you told me something offline around they're actually getting more budget to accomplish these kinds of mission-oriented goals.
Absolutely. There's been a big response in public sector to various executive orders and directives that have come down lately. One of those that people have talked a lot about is what people are calling the Zero Trust executive order from President Biden. That's 14028, that really mandates that federal public sector organizations get their act together around implementing principles of zero trust for security. And of course, one of those is uncompromisable backups. Another big factor that's been present here is a lot of the stimulus funding that accompanied COVID, because there were billions of dollars in grants that were available for state and local governments to modernize their services, and cyber modernization was a big part of that. So I think this might be a reason why we're seeing this focus and the improvement that we are here. And actually, that ties into one point that I want to make about the research that I'd love us to wrap up on, because it's easy to talk sort of about what's going wrong, about bad things in the environment.
Yep.
But I was very heartened when we asked one question that we always ask this year. And Jason, I know you've probably walked folks through this with the Data Protection Trends Report in the past. We always ask, hey, if you did get hit by ransomware, and you'll notice that not all 4,200 organizations did get ransomed. The respondents to this particular question were just over 1,600. But if you did get hit, how much of your production data did the bad guys encrypt? How much of your data was destroyed? And you'll notice in the general population, that is the global survey sample, that number was just about 40%. So pick four terabytes of data out of your 10 terabytes of data, and the bad guys encrypted that as part of their attack. The flip side of the coin, of course, is, okay, once that 39% of your data was encrypted, how much of it were you actually able to get back when you recovered? And on average, global sample, that data was about 55% recoverable. And Jason, I know you do the math, you walk folks through this. If 40% of my data is encrypted and I can only get half of it back, then on average, you're going to lose 1/5 of your data if you get with a ransomware attack. Nobody wants to go to their governor, to the head of their agency, to their mayor, and say to their police chief and say, congratulations to us, we just lost, 20% of the data that we had in the data center. We may have to, retry a bunch of public sector cases because we no longer have the evidence from them, for example, or whatever. But for public sector, the news was a little bit better. And I'll just leave on this good note, apropos of the funding and some of the efforts that have been put in over the last couple of years. When we ask public sector how much of your data was affected in a ransomware attack, the number is fully 10% better on average, which I find really heartening. Rather than 39%, on average, 29% of production data was affected. The other side of the coin is, okay, for that 1/3 of your data or a little bit less that got hit, how much of it could you get back? There's also good news on this front. Public sector organizations were on average almost 10% more capable of recovering data, recovered almost 10% more data than the general pool. So while I think it would be premature to declare victory and say we've won this fight, at least some of the metrics that we're looking at are going in a good direction around this battle, particularly against data being encrypted and held for ransom by cyber adversaries.
My friend, I don't think we can ever say won. We might be able to say winning, but I think this is going to unfortunately be another one of those proverbial battles that never ends. Jeff, I cannot thank you enough for coming on. I thank you also for your friendship for over 2 decades along the way and your collaboration over the years in a couple different companies. As we kind of sign off for today, let's bring up the data that you're looking at here actually derives from the Data Protection Trends Report. That is one of only 4 reports that's been produced over just the last year from the strategic research team at Veeam. We're going to have to update this chart in a couple of weeks because the ransomware 23 report is going to be coming out in just a few weeks. But also for those folks that are cloud-minded, there's the cloud protection trends on the IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. Certainly one flavor of SaaS that warrants specialization is Salesforce. We have data on that. And then, of course, the DPR report as well. In closing off, a couple things. So this Thursday, Rick Vanover on May 4th is going to be, may the 4th be with you. I actually am doing a webinar that day, lightsaber and all. But earlier in the day, Rick Vanover is going to be meeting with Matt Bader and Mark Pollan to talk about hybrid cloud architectures and what does a reference design look like. This time next week, Dave Russell will be meeting with Object First and talking about that. And Jeff, you and I are going to go hang out in Miami with a couple thousand of our closest friends. If you needed any more reasons to come down to Miami other than just to hang out with Jeff and cool people like Jeff, the VO Miami 1001 promo code will get you 10% off. And I think we've got a video to give you even more reasons to join us in Miami in just 3 weeks. As always, thanks for watching.